Jordan Blake exited the gleaming glass doors of the luxurious shopping mall. A designer shopping bag hanging from his hand. He was tall for his age. Dressed in crisp, well-fitted clothes that spoke to his family's wealth and status. At just 17, Jordan had an unmistakable aura of confidence, carrying himself with a maturity and ease that often turned heads. His family was well known in the area, not only for their success but also for the principles his father, Malcolm Blake, had instilled in them: honesty, respect, and above all, self-worth. But none of that mattered to the man who noticed Jordan from across the bustling mall plaza, Officer Greg Grant. Hardened by years on the force, Grant had seen all kinds of people. Or so he believed. And, in his mind, people like Jordan only fit one category. His eyes narrowed, instinct and bias intertwining as he watched the young man make his way across the plaza, the high-end bag swinging at his side. Grant couldn't shake the thought that this kid didn't belong here. Surely, someone like him, a young black man in designer clothes, wasn't here legally. At least not in Officer Grant's book. Without a second thought, Grant radioed in for backup. As Jordan continued toward the parking lot, lost in thought, he heard a sharp voice call out from behind him. "Hey! You! Stop right there!" Jordan turned, seeing Officer Grant approaching with two other officers flanking him. There was a glint in Grant's eyes that made Jordan's stomach twist uncomfortably. Still, he held his ground, keeping his face calm, just as his father had taught him in moments like these. "Yes, officer?" Jordan asked politely, his voice calm but cautious. Grant didn't return the courtesy. "Where'd you get that bag?" he demanded, eyes flicking to the shopping bag and then back to Jordan with suspicion. Jordan blinked, momentarily taken aback. "I bought it," he replied, holding up the bag for them to see. "I just came from the store." He started to reach into his pocket for the receipt, but Officer Grant's hand shot out, stopping him. "Keep your hands where I can see them," Grant ordered, his voice laced with a distrust that was clear to everyone in the immediate vicinity. People nearby began to slow down, their eyes shifting between Jordan and the officers, curiosity and unease spreading through the crowd. "But I have the receipt right here," Jordan started, his voice a mixture of confusion and frustration. "Enough!" Grant snapped. "You can explain yourself at the station." Before Jordan could process what was happening, one of the officers grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back. He winced, the pain unexpected and sharp. "Wait! I didn't do anything wrong," Jordan protested, struggling against the officer's iron grip. Panic bubbled up inside him as he felt the cold metal of the handcuffs snap around his wrists. His heart pounded, his mind racing. He was just a kid buying clothes. This wasn't supposed to happen. "Yeah. That's what they all say," Officer Grant muttered under his breath. The words stung, hitting Jordan harder than he expected. He realized with sickening clarity that to them, he was already guilty. Nothing he said or did would change that in their eyes. He wanted to scream, to shout, but his father's voice echoed in his mind, urging him to stay calm, to stay in control. "Officer, please," Jordan said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "I haven't done anything. I can show you my receipt. My father is on his way." But Grant only scoffed. "We'll see about that, kid." He motioned to the officers to lead Jordan to the squad car, completely ignoring Jordan's protests and the murmurs of the growing crowd. People around them began to pull out their phones, recording the scene. Some whispered to each other, the injustice of the situation evident to anyone watching. A few shouted words of encouragement, telling Jordan to hold his head high. But no one dared to intervene. As they dragged Jordan toward the squad car, he caught the sympathetic gaze of an elderly woman who stood frozen, her hand over her mouth in shock. For a split second, their eyes met, and Jordan could see the horror and sorrow in her face. But it did nothing to ease the fear pulsing through him. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Jordan saw a familiar black sedan pull up to the edge of the crowd. His father, Malcolm Blake, stepped out of the car, dressed in a tailored suit and exuding a calm authority. He cut through the crowd with purpose, his gaze fixed solely on his son. Jordan felt a wave of relief wash over him, but it was tinged with worry. He knew his father was a strong man, but he wasn't sure how anyone, even his father, could make this right. Officer Grant noticed Malcolm as he approached, his eyes narrowing. "Sir, this is a police matter," he said curtly, his tone barely masking the hostility in his voice. Malcolm's gaze was cold and measured. "I understand perfectly, officer," he replied in a voice so calm it seemed to silence the air around them. "And I'm here to make sure my son's rights are respected." Grant's lips curled in a sneer. "Your son was acting suspiciously. He's being taken in for questioning." Suspiciously? Malcolm's eyebrows rose. He looked at his son, then back at the officer. What exactly did he do that was suspicious? Grant faltered for a moment, the confidence in his tone wavering. He appeared to be carrying items that we believe may have been stolen." Malcolm's eyes narrowed, and his voice took on an edge that was as sharp as it was controlled. "Do you have any evidence of that? Or is it simply because of the color of his skin?" The crowd was silent, the question hanging in the air like a heavy weight. Officer Grant's face flushed red, anger and embarrassment clashing as he struggled to maintain his composure. But Malcolm didn't wait for an answer. Instead, he turned his gaze to the other officers, his voice firm and unyielding. "My son has committed no crime," he said, each word clear and deliberate. "And if you insist on arresting him, you'd better be prepared to defend that decision in court." The tension was palpable, the crowd holding its breath as Malcolm's words settled over them. Officer Grant shifted uncomfortably, his earlier bravado beginning to crumble. The bystanders murmured amongst themselves, some nodding in agreement, others recording every second of the confrontation. For the first time, Jordan saw uncertainty in the officers' faces, and a sliver of hope ignited within him. He stood taller, his father's presence filling him with a newfound courage. Malcolm took a step closer to the officers, his gaze unwavering. "I suggest you release my son," he said quietly, but with a force that was impossible to ignore. Now, after a tense pause, one of the officers exchanged a glance with his partner and then stepped forward to unlock the handcuffs. Jordan rubbed his wrists, relief flooding through him, though his heart still pounded from the ordeal. He looked up at his father, gratitude and admiration shining in his eyes. As the officers retreated, Malcolm placed a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him away from the crowd and toward the car. The bystanders watched in silence, their expressions a mix of awe and respect. Jordan glanced back, meeting the eyes of the elderly woman who had been watching. She gave him a small, encouraging nod, as if to say, "Stand tall. You did nothing wrong." As they drove away, Jordan sat in silence, his mind replaying every second of what had just happened. He looked over at his father, a question lingering on his lips. "Dad, how did you stay so calm?" Malcolm's eyes softened as he looked over at his son. "Because sometimes, Jordan, calm is the most powerful weapon you can have. Never forget that." Jordan nodded, His heart filled with a new understanding and a deeper respect for his father. He knew that this was only the beginning, that they still had a long way to go. But with his father by his side, he felt ready for whatever was to come as the car wound its way through the streets. Jordan replayed every second of the encounter in his mind. The lingering sting of humiliation was etched deeply, made worse by the glances and whispers he knew had followed him from the mall entrance. He could still feel the cold, tight grip of the handcuffs around his wrists, the indifference in Officer Grant's eyes, and the helplessness that had swallowed him whole as he'd been pushed toward the squad car. It was impossible to forget how he'd felt like a criminal, even though he had done absolutely nothing wrong. In the car, Malcolm Blake kept his gaze forward, his hands steady on the wheel. The familiar streets passed by in a blur, but neither father nor son spoke, each of them caught in the silent storm of thoughts. For Jordan, the silence felt heavy, thickened by everything he wanted to ask but couldn't bring himself to say. He stole a glance at his father, wondering what Malcolm had really felt back there, whether the calm he had displayed had been as unshakable as it seemed. Finally, Malcolm broke the silence, his voice steady and composed. "I know this wasn't easy," he began, his eyes still fixed on the road ahead. "But you handled yourself well." Jordan's chest tightened. He appreciated his father's words, but a question burned on his tongue. "Dad, why didn't you do more?" he asked quietly, unable to keep the edge of frustration out of his voice. "You could have called them out right there. Made them look as bad as they made me feel." Malcolm's gaze remained steady. He let the question hang in the air for a moment, weighing his words. Because sometimes, Jordan, direct confrontation isn't the only way to win a battle. It's about knowing when to strike and when to hold back. Had I let anger control me, they'd have written us off as just another case of aggression, a father defending his delinquent son. That's how they see it. Jordan clenched his fists, the anger still simmering within him. But they already think that. Nothing we did made them see us differently. Malcolm sighed, his eyes softening as he looked over at his son. "I know. And that's the painful part. But, Jordan, every action they took, every assumption they made, is now on record. And the entire incident was recorded by witnesses. The truth will be seen clearly by others who will stand with us. There's a power in letting the truth speak for itself." For a moment, Jordan was silent, absorbing his father's words. The wisdom Malcolm spoke with was undeniable, but it didn't erase the lingering bitterness Jordan felt. It feels wrong that we have to wait for justice. Dad. That I have to be treated like a criminal just because of the color of my skin." Malcolm's hand tightened on the steering wheel, his expression hardening. "I know it's not right. And I won't pretend that it is. But I also won't let you believe that what happened today defines who you are or your worth. People will judge, they'll make assumptions. But, son, their ignorance is not your burden to carry." Jordan felt a flicker of relief but remained troubled. He nodded, realizing that he wasn't just learning about the world, he was learning about himself and what he would need to face in it. As they pulled into the driveway, Malcolm's phone rang. It was Detective Roberts, a close friend and ally who had known the Blake family for years. As Malcolm answered, Jordan watched his father's face carefully, hoping this would provide more clarity, some assurance. "Malcolm," Detective Roberts said, his tone concerned. "I just saw the footage. You and Jordan have been all over the news since it happened. The whole thing is blowing up online, people are outraged. It's not just the usual talk, it's serious this time." Malcolm nodded, glancing at Jordan with a reassuring look. "Good. The more people see this, the harder it'll be for them to sweep it under the rug. What's the next step?" "Well, 4-1. You and Jordan should prepare for media attention. This isn't going away quietly. I'm arranging a meeting with the precinct head. I think it's time they addressed what happened publicly. Malcolm's voice remained calm, but there was a fierceness behind it. I'll be ready. After the call ended, Jordan felt a surge of determination. His father was right, this incident could serve as a turning point. Something larger than his own hurt. Yet, as he looked at his father, Jordan realized how much weight Malcolm was carrying. How often he had probably held back anger for the sake of protecting his family. The next morning, as Malcolm and Jordan arrived at the precinct, they were greeted by a wave of reporters. Microphones and cameras clustered around them. The cacophony of voices almost overwhelming. Questions were thrown at them, each one echoing the same need for answers. The same indignation and demand for justice. Mr. Blake, how does it feel to know that your son was treated like this, despite his innocence? Jordan, do you think this would have happened if you were white? Do you believe there's systemic racism within the police force? Jordan felt his pulse quicken. But Malcolm placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. They had prepared for this moment. Rehearsed what they would say. Choosing their words carefully. Malcolm stepped forward. His calm and composed demeanor silencing the crowd momentarily. Thank you for your concern, he began. His voice carrying both authority and conviction. My son was subjected to an experience no one should have to endure. He was unfairly judged. Falsely accused. And treated with no respect simply because of his appearance. This is not just a problem with a few individuals. This is a problem deeply embedded in our society. In the very institutions meant to protect us. He paused, letting his words sink in. Feeling the weight of every eye on him. We're here today to demand accountability. Not just for my son, but for every young person who faces prejudice based solely on how they look. I will not let my son become another statistic or be used to perpetuate harmful stereotypes. We stand here today as a family. United. And we will not be silent. The crowd erupted into applause. Reporters struggling to keep up with the torrent of words being spoken by onlookers. Jordan looked at his father. His respect deepening. The admiration clear in his eyes. As they entered the precinct, Officer Grant's expression was one of barely concealed irritation as he watched them approach. Beside him stood the precinct's head, Captain Diaz, who looked at Malcolm and Jordan with an air of cautious respect. Clearly, he understood the gravity of the situation. Mr. Blake, Captain Diaz greeted, extending a hand. Thank you for coming. Malcolm shook his hand. His expression neutral. Thank you for meeting with us. I trust you understand the importance of addressing this properly. Captain Diaz nodded. A shadow of discomfort crossing his face. Absolutely. This incident is regrettable. And we intend to review all relevant footage and testimonies. It's our goal to ensure that justice is served here. As they sat down in the conference room, Jordan felt a sudden surge of empowerment. The weight of the past day's events still clung to him. But now it felt different, it felt like a burden he no longer had to carry alone. He was here with his father. And together, they would demand justice. Not just for themselves, but for every young person who faced unfair treatment. As he looked at the faces around him, Jordan realized that this moment, this struggle, was now bigger than him. It was a call for change. A fight for dignity and respect. A story that demanded to be told. And with his father by his side, he knew they would see it through. No matter what came next, Jordan's chest tightened as they drove home from the precinct. The media storm was still fresh in his mind. And as much as he admired his father's ability to face it head-on, a deep unease lingered. That day had revealed a harsh truth he'd always sensed but never fully grasped until now. It wasn't just the act of being unfairly accused, it was the eyes that had looked at him as if he were guilty from the start. When they reached home, Malcolm invited Jordan to sit with him in the quiet of their living room. He looked at his son, his gaze penetrating, yet gentle. There was a calm strength to Malcolm's presence, an air that had always made Jordan feel protected. Today was rough. Malcolm began softly, breaking the silence. But it's not just about what happened. It's about what we're going to do next. Jordan listened, nodding slowly. He wanted to move forward, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. What's next? Dad? It feels like no matter what we do, people are going to see us as less than. Like I don't belong here. Malcolm's face softened, and he took a deep breath. Jordan, you belong wherever you choose to be. That's your right. One that no one can take from you. But what happened today, it's more than just your experience. It's a reality that many people face. And if we want to change that, we can't just fight back for ourselves. We have to stand up for everyone. Jordan leaned back, absorbing his father's words. He knew Malcolm wasn't just talking about public statements or social media. This was something deeper, more profound. His father had always taught him that strength came from within, from a place of self-respect and unyielding belief in his worth, no matter how others tried to label him. The next day, Jordan and Malcolm met with a close friend, Lisa Chang, a prominent civil rights attorney. She had been following their story since the incident, and her presence now marked the beginning of their fight not just to clear Jordan's name but to hold those responsible accountable. Lisa welcomed them into her office, gesturing for them to take a seat. Her demeanor was calm, focused, yet her eyes held a fire that Jordan immediately noticed. Malcolm. Jordan, she began. I've spoken with several witnesses from the mall and reviewed the footage circulating online. This case is strong. And it's not just about what happened to you, Jordan. It's about setting a precedent. Showing that no one, regardless of their position, has the right to act on prejudice without facing consequences. Jordan nodded, though a knot of nervousness twisted in his stomach. This was uncharted territory for him. He had never thought that something so personal would turn into something so public, so political. So, what's the plan? Malcolm asked, his tone steady. Jordan could sense his father's resolve, a resolve that filled him with pride and gave him courage. We're going to file a civil rights lawsuit, Lisa replied firmly, her gaze shifting from Malcolm to Jordan. This case can set a legal precedent, hold the officers accountable, and raise awareness about racial profiling on a large scale. Jordan's eyes widened. The weight of it all sank in. This wasn't just about clearing his name, it was about changing a system, challenging a mindset. What does that mean for me? He asked, his voice a mixture of curiosity and trepidation. Lisa gave him a reassuring smile. It means you'll have to speak out. People will look to you as a voice in this case. And it won't be easy. But you have something that not many others do, a support system. A family that believes in you. And a voice that deserves to be heard. You can make a difference. Jordan. Her words lit a spark in him. He had been the victim. But now, for the first time, he could see himself as something more, a beacon. A force for change. It was daunting. Yes. But also empowering. The following weeks were a whirlwind of legal preparations, interviews, and strategy sessions with Lisa. Each day brought new developments, more media attention, and a surge of public interest. As they prepared for the upcoming court case, Malcolm continued to guide Jordan, helping him navigate the storm of emotions and public scrutiny. One evening, As they were preparing for a particularly important media interview, Malcolm pulled Jordan aside. He looked at his son with pride but also a hint of concern. "Are you ready for this, son?" he asked, his voice gentle. "It's not going to be easy. The public eye can be harsh, and they'll try to break you down. You need to be ready for that." Jordan met his father's gaze, his own expression determined. "I am, Dad. I know it's going to be tough. But if this can help others, if it can stop this from happening to someone else, then I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Malcolm nodded, a flicker of admiration passing over his face. "Good. Just remember, no matter what happens, you have a family who believes in you." The interview went live the next day. It was broadcast on national television, reaching millions across the country. Jordan and Malcolm sat side by side, their expressions calm yet resolute as they shared their story. Jordan spoke about the humiliation, the fear, and the anger he had felt in that moment. The feeling of being judged solely by the color of his skin. "It's not just about what happened to me," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "It's about a system that allows people to make snap judgments, to assume guilt without cause. And that needs to change." The interviewer looked at him thoughtfully. "Jordan, if you could say one thing to Officer Grant and the others involved, what would it be?" Jordan paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'd tell them that I'm more than what they assumed I was. That they don't have the right to define me, or anyone else, based on their biases. And I'd tell them that I hope this experience changes the way they see people. Because no one should have to feel the way I did that day." The interview went viral, sparking a national conversation about racial profiling and the experiences of young black men in America. As comments flooded in from people of all backgrounds, Jordan was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support and solidarity. But with the support came voices of dissent. Some defended the officers. Others accused Jordan and his family of exaggerating the story for attention. Malcolm prepared him for the backlash, explaining that progress often stirred up resistance. "People are afraid of change, Jordan. But remember, you're not doing this for them. You're doing this for everyone who has been wronged and didn't have a voice." As the court date approached, the tension grew. The day before the trial, Malcolm and Jordan met with Lisa for a final strategy session. She went over the key points of their case, highlighting the testimony from witnesses, the video footage, and the powerful public support they had garnered. When the day of the trial arrived, the courtroom was packed. The energy in the room was tense, charged with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. As Jordan took the stand, he felt the weight of countless eyes upon him. But as he looked out at his father, sitting in the front row with a look of unbreakable pride, he knew he was ready. Lisa guided him through his testimony, encouraging him to recount the events with honesty and clarity. Jordan spoke about the disbelief he'd felt as Officer Grant had accused him, the pain of being handcuffed in front of a crowd, and the anger of being reduced to a stereotype. The courtroom was silent as he spoke, every word resonating with the weight of his experience. When he finished, Lisa looked at him with a quiet pride, knowing that his story had touched everyone in the room. The trial was long and grueling, filled with objections, arguments, and moments of raw emotion. But through it all, Jordan and his family remained steadfast. They knew that this was bigger than them, that this was a fight for justice, a stand against a system that had oppressed so many for so long. When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom held its breath. The judge's voice was steady as he declared, "The court finds that the actions of the officers were unjustified and rooted in bias. This case stands as a testament to the need for systemic change within our institutions." A wave of relief washed over Jordan. tears filling his eyes as he looked at his father. Malcolm reached out, pulling him into a tight embrace. They had won. But it wasn't just a victory for them, it was a victory for everyone who had ever felt the weight of prejudice. The sting of being judged unfairly. As they stepped out of the courthouse, the crowd outside erupted into applause. People from all walks of life, strangers who had been moved by their story, gathered to show their support. Jordan felt a new sense of purpose, a strength he hadn't known before. He was no longer just a victim, he was a voice, a force for change. And as he stood there, surrounded by his family and supporters, he knew that this was only the beginning. The journey ahead would be challenging. But he was ready. Together, they would continue to fight, to demand justice, and to pave the way for a world where no one had to live in fear of being judged for who they were as they left the courthouse after the first day of the trial. The intensity of the day's events weighed heavily on Jordan. He couldn't shake the image of Officer Grant's unwavering, cold gaze. The way he had defended his actions with no hint of remorse. Grant had testified earlier that day, using words like suspicious behavior and protective instincts, trying to frame his actions as justified. Yet, as he spoke, Jordan felt the bitter sting of those assumptions once again, feeling as if he were reliving the entire experience. Outside the courthouse, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Supporters and protesters alike had gathered, holding signs with slogans calling for justice, equality, and accountability. Jordan was overwhelmed by the sheer number of people who had come, each of them inspired by his story. It was a strange and humbling feeling, knowing that his pain, his struggle, had become a rallying cry for so many. Among the crowd were familiar faces, neighbors, friends from school, even people from the community he'd only ever seen in passing. He was moved by their support. But he also knew that each face carried its own story, its own experiences with prejudice or injustice. As he and Malcolm made their way through the crowd, Jordan noticed a group of young men, roughly his age, standing off to the side. One of them, a boy named Tyrell, who Jordan recognized from a local youth center, stepped forward, his face solemn. "Hey, Jordan," Tyrell said, his voice tinged with a mix of admiration and solidarity. "I just wanted to say, what you're doing, it matters. We've all been there. Man, maybe not in court like this, but we've all felt it. You know? People looking at us, assuming things, acting like we're not good enough." Jordan nodded, feeling a connection he hadn't anticipated. He realized that this fight wasn't just his own. He was standing here for all of them. For Tyrell and the countless others who had been judged, dismissed, and ignored because of their race or appearance. "Thanks, Tyrell," Jordan replied, his voice soft but steady. "I'm doing this for all of us. We all deserve better." Tyrell gave him a firm nod, and the two exchanged a silent understanding, one that transcended words. The following day, the trial resumed, and tensions were high. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with anticipation. Lisa was prepared for the challenges ahead. Today, she would cross-examine Officer Grant, digging into the deeper layers of bias and prejudice that had driven his actions. As Officer Grant took the stand again, Lisa's questions were sharp and relentless, each one calculated to reveal the underlying assumptions that had guided his treatment of Jordan. "Officer Grant," Lisa began, her voice calm and precise, "can you tell us what specifically drew your attention to my client that day?" Grant shifted uncomfortably in his seat, glancing briefly at the jury before answering. He was acting suspiciously. He had a designer bag, and he looked out of place. Lisa raised an eyebrow. allowing a moment of silence to emphasize his words before continuing. Out of place? Can you explain what you mean by that? Grant hesitated, clearly struggling to articulate his thoughts without revealing his biases. Well, it's a high-end shopping district. You don't typically see teenagers like him carrying bags like that without reason. The courtroom murmured. And Lisa seized the moment, her gaze piercing as she looked at the officer. So, in your opinion, Officer Grant, what does someone like him mean? Could it be that you assumed, simply based on his appearance, that he was doing something wrong? Grant's face flushed, and he stammered slightly. No. I was just doing my job. My job is to keep the area safe. Lisa pressed on, her voice unwavering. Keeping the area safe? From what? A teenager with a shopping bag? Or were you simply assuming that a young black man with expensive belongings must have obtained them illegally? The silence that followed was deafening. Grant's discomfort was palpable, and Jordan could feel the power shifting. His story was no longer just his own. Lisa was turning it into a powerful indictment of every bias, every unfair assumption that people like Grant held. Grant finally broke the silence, his voice defensive. I was acting on my instincts. Sometimes instincts are all we have to go on. Lisa's gaze was steely. But your instincts, Officer Grant, are not free from bias. And they led you to unjustly detain, handcuff, and humiliate an innocent young man. Your instincts treated him as a criminal when he had done nothing wrong. Lisa's final statement hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Grant shifted uncomfortably, his bravado from the previous day shattered. The prosecution's case had taken a blow, and it was clear that the weight of evidence and public opinion was shifting in Jordan's favor as the trial continued. The public response grew louder, evolving into a movement. People began gathering outside the courthouse every day, their numbers swelling as the story spread. Community leaders, activists, and even celebrities joined the cause, using their platforms to demand accountability and justice. Jordan felt the power of their support but also the weight of it. His story was no longer just his own, it had become a symbol, a rallying point for a larger fight against injustice and systemic racism. Each day, as he walked into the courthouse, he saw the faces of people who looked to him as a beacon of hope, their eyes filled with respect and encouragement. One evening, as they left the courthouse, a well-known civil rights leader named Angela Morris approached them. She was in her 60s, with a history of activism dating back to the civil rights movement, and her presence radiated wisdom and strength. Jordan, she greeted him warmly, her voice strong despite her age. You're doing something remarkable here. People see you. They believe in you. This isn't just about a single case anymore, it's about changing a system that has treated people unfairly for too long. Jordan felt a swell of pride mixed with responsibility. He realized that this wasn't just a fight for his own dignity, it was a fight for justice. A fight that extended beyond himself. Angela placed a hand on his shoulder, her gaze steady. This fight, it won't be easy. You'll face pushback, and there will be days when you'll feel like giving up. But remember, you're not alone. We're all standing with you. Her words gave him strength, a renewed sense of purpose. He knew now that this journey wasn't just about proving his innocence, it was about dismantling the prejudices and stereotypes that had led to his wrongful detention. And it was about inspiring others to demand a fairer, more just world. On the third day of the trial, an unexpected witness took the stand. The elderly woman who had seen Jordan's arrest, Mrs. Evelyn Harper, had come forward, determined to share what she had witnessed. Her voice was soft but resolute as she recounted the events of that day. I was there, she began, her hands trembling slightly. "I saw how they treated him. How they looked at him. It was wrong. There was no reason to believe he was guilty of anything. They didn't even give him a chance to explain." Her testimony was powerful, painting a vivid picture of the unfair treatment Jordan had endured. She described the look of pain and confusion on his face, the way the officers had ignored his attempts to speak, and the way he had been treated with such disrespect. Her words stirred the courtroom, and even the jurors seemed visibly moved. As Mrs. Harper stepped down, she approached Jordan, her eyes filled with empathy. "Young man, I just want you to know, you deserved better. I hope this helps bring you the justice you deserve." Jordan felt a lump in his throat, overwhelmed by her kindness. He thanked her, his voice thick with emotion. Her words gave him a renewed sense of hope, a belief that maybe, just maybe, they were going to win this battle, finally. After days of intense testimony, cross-examinations, and powerful statements, the trial came to an end. The judge addressed the court, his voice steady but carrying the weight of the decision. "This court has reviewed the evidence, the testimonies, and the facts surrounding this case. We find that the actions of the officers were rooted in bias and an unjustified assumption of guilt. This case is a clear example of the need for systemic reform to prevent such injustices from occurring in the future." The verdict was a victory, a moment of justice that Jordan and his family had fought so hard for. As the judge continued to speak, Jordan felt the relief wash over him, the burden of his ordeal finally beginning to lift. Malcolm wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, their bond stronger than ever. The courtroom erupted in applause, the outpouring of support from the crowd a testament to the impact of their journey. Jordan had gone from being a victim to becoming a voice for change, a symbol of resilience and the unbreakable strength of family in the days that followed. Jordan's story became a catalyst for change. Inspired by his courage, communities across the nation organized rallies, workshops, and discussions aimed at addressing implicit bias and racial profiling. New policies were proposed to hold law enforcement accountable, and programs were introduced to educate officers on recognizing and dismantling their biases. Jordan continued to speak out, joining his father and leaders like Angela Morris to spread a message of unity, justice, and hope. He had become more than a young man with a painful story, he was now a leader, a force for change in a world that desperately needed it. As he looked out at the crowd at one of their gatherings, Jordan felt a sense of purpose he had never known before. His journey was far from over, but he knew now that he was ready for whatever lay ahead. With his father by his side and the support of a movement that had grown far beyond him, Jordan stood tall, knowing that together they were unstoppable. The victory in court felt monumental, not just for Jordan and his family, but for countless people across the country. As he stood on the courthouse steps, surrounded by supporters, journalists, and his own family, Jordan felt a sense of closure mingled with a new awareness. He understood now that this moment wasn't an end, it was the beginning of something far larger. The first few days after the trial were a whirlwind of media attention and public interest. News outlets covered the verdict. Social media was flooded with messages of support, and Jordan's story continued to spark heated debates. It was a moment of cultural reckoning, with people from all walks of life reflecting on the insidious nature of prejudice and the urgent need for reform. But beyond the headlines and public discussions, Jordan found himself facing a quieter, more personal journey, one that involved understanding his place in this movement and the responsibility that came with it. Back at home one evening, Malcolm gathered the family in their living room. The house was peaceful, a welcome change from the intensity of the past few weeks. But Malcolm's face was serious as he looked at his son, his gaze filled with pride and the weight of unspoken advice. "Jordan," he began, his voice calm but steady. You did something remarkable. What you've been through, and how you chose to respond, that's something not many people could handle with the strength you've shown. Jordan felt a swell of pride, but also a flicker of doubt. I don't know if I was as strong as you think, Dad. There were times I wanted to walk away, to just let it all go. Malcolm nodded, understanding. Strength doesn't mean you didn't feel fear or frustration, son. It means you faced those feelings and still stood for what was right. And now you have a chance to take that strength further. But remember, the road ahead won't always be easy. Jordan listened, taking in his father's words, realizing that this was more than just a victory, it was a foundation for the future. Malcolm continued, his tone gentle but firm. You've become a part of something bigger than yourself. Something that will require patience, resilience, and heart. If you choose to continue down this path, know that you'll have our support. But you'll also need to find that support within yourself. Jordan thought about his father's words, understanding the gravity of the journey he was about to undertake. It was no longer just about proving his innocence, it was about building a legacy of justice and compassion over the next few months. Jordan's life transformed in ways he had never imagined. Invitations to speak at events, schools, and forums poured in. Each one an opportunity to share his story and advocate for change. He found himself standing before audiences of young people, community leaders, activists, and sometimes even law enforcement officers, all eager to hear his perspective. Each speech was both a challenge and a revelation. Jordan learned to share his experience without bitterness, to turn his pain into a call for unity rather than division. With each talk, he could feel the impact growing, the way his story resonated with others who had faced similar struggles. His words encouraged other young people to speak up, to challenge the biases they encountered and to believe in their own worth. One evening, after a speech at a local university, a young woman approached him with tears in her eyes. She introduced herself as Sophia, a first-year law student who had watched his trial and followed his journey closely. Jordan, she said, her voice trembling with emotion, I just wanted to thank you. I'm here today because of you. Seeing you stand up, seeing you fight for what's right, it made me realize I wanted to make a difference too. I decided to study law so I could be a part of the change we need. Jordan was moved, humbled by her words. He realized that his journey was no longer just his own, it was inspiring others to step up and create their own paths toward justice. He knew now that this was his purpose, that his story had the power to transform lives. Just as it had transformed his own, the momentum from Jordan's case continued to grow. And soon he was collaborating with leaders in the civil rights community, including Angela Morris, the seasoned activist who had supported him throughout the trial. Angela recognized Jordan's potential and encouraged him to channel his energy into something lasting. Together, they established the Justice and Equality Initiative, a program designed to combat racial profiling and educate communities on the importance of empathy and understanding. They organized workshops and seminars for police departments, schools, and community organizations, focusing on dismantling implicit biases and fostering trust. As Jordan traveled to different cities, he met countless people who had been impacted by his story. Many shared their own experiences, stories of encounters with bias, and the struggle for acceptance. Each story reinforced his commitment to the cause, reminding him that this movement was about more than just changing laws, it was about changing hearts and minds. The initiative quickly gained traction, attracting support from prominent figures, community leaders, and ordinary people who believed in the vision Jordan and Angela had set forth. Donations poured in, allowing them to expand their reach. And soon, The initiative was a national force for change, but not everyone was supportive. As the initiative grew, so did the resistance. There were those who criticized Jordan, accusing him of exaggerating his story or seeking fame. Negative headlines and online backlash surfaced, questioning his motives and even targeting his family. It was difficult to face. And at times, Jordan felt the weight of it pressing down on him, testing his resolve. One night, after a particularly harsh news segment, Jordan found himself sitting alone, his mind heavy with doubt. He had never asked for this spotlight, never expected to be scrutinized so intensely. He wondered if the fight was worth it, if he could keep going in the face of such opposition. Malcolm found him sitting there, lost in thought. He took a seat beside his son, the silence between them comfortable and familiar. Finally, he spoke, his voice gentle. "Jordan, the world will always have people who doubt you, who fear change because it threatens the status quo. But that doesn't mean you're wrong. And it doesn't mean you're alone. You have a gift. Son, a voice that people believe in. Don't let fear or doubt rob you of that." Jordan looked at his father, the reassurance in his words filling him with renewed strength. He realized that every moment of struggle, every harsh word or look, was just a part of the journey. It wasn't about pleasing everyone, it was about standing firm in what he believed to be right. The next day, he returned to his work with a newfound determination, ready to face whatever challenges came his way as the years passed. The Justice and Equality Initiative continued to grow, evolving from a single program into a national organization. Jordan, now in his 20s, had become a respected leader and advocate, his name synonymous with the fight for equality. The initiative had helped reform policies, provide resources for marginalized communities, and foster a culture of empathy and understanding within law enforcement and beyond. Jordan often reflected on the journey he had taken, from a high school kid wrongfully detained to a leader of a movement that was transforming lives. He knew his work wasn't finished, there were still biases to break, injustices to address, and minds to change. But he felt fulfilled, driven by a purpose that extended beyond himself. One day, after a particularly impactful workshop with a group of young students, Jordan found himself walking through the neighborhood where he had grown up. He paused outside his old school, memories flooding back. He thought of the boy he had once been, uncertain of his place in the world, and smiled. He had come a long way, and he had done it with the support of his family and the strength they had instilled in him. As he stood there, a group of young boys ran past him, their laughter filling the air. One of them stopped, recognizing him. "Are you Jordan Blake?" the boy asked, his eyes wide with admiration. Jordan smiled, nodding. "Yeah, that's me." The boy's face lit up, and he glanced back at his friends. "My dad told me about you. He said you stood up for people like us, that you fought so we'd be treated fairly." Jordan felt a lump in his throat, touched by the boy's words. "Well," he said softly, "I did it for all of us. And one day, maybe you'll stand up too." The boy nodded, his eyes shining with hope. "I will," he said confidently before running off to join his friends. As Jordan watched him go, he felt a sense of peace, knowing that his journey had planted seeds of change in the next generation. He had faced hardship, struggled against prejudice, and transformed his pain into purpose. And in doing so, he had left a legacy of justice, resilience, and the unbreakable power of standing up for what is right. In that moment, Jordan knew that his story had only begun. The impact of his journey would ripple through time, touching lives and inspiring others to fight for a world where everyone, regardless of appearance, would be seen, valued, and respected. The verdict marked a turning point in Jordan's life. But he soon realized that the real journey was only beginning. Each step forward revealed new layers of challenge and growth, transforming him in ways he hadn't anticipated. With the Justice and Equality Initiative gaining momentum, he was pulled into a whirlwind of projects, events, and conversations that continually forced him to confront and refine his understanding of justice, identity, and resilience. One of the most unexpected developments came when a local police chief, Tom Alvarez, reached out to Jordan with a surprising proposal. Alvarez, a seasoned officer, had been following the case closely, and while he had initially felt defensive, the outcome of the trial had made him reconsider his perspectives. He invited Jordan to co-lead a workshop with his officers on racial profiling and implicit bias. It was an olive branch that took Jordan by surprise. Working directly with law enforcement was a risk, but he felt compelled to take it. If he wanted to create real change, he knew he had to reach the people at the heart of the issue. The day of the workshop, Jordan entered the precinct with Angela Morris at his side, feeling the familiar tension that arose every time he encountered the uniformed officers. The room was filled with officers, some of whom had hardened expressions, others visibly uncomfortable. Jordan felt their eyes on him, some skeptical, others curious. He had prepared himself for this. Yet standing here, he felt anew, raw vulnerability. He had spent months speaking to the public, to people who saw him as a hero. But here, in a room filled with law enforcement, he was just a young man challenging everything they had been taught to believe. Chief Alvarez stepped forward, addressing the group. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his tone measured and thoughtful. "Today, we're here to have a difficult but necessary conversation." Jordan's story showed us that we need to address our own biases and assumptions, not just as officers but as human beings. Alvarez gestured to Jordan, who took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. "I'm not here to accuse anyone," Jordan started, his voice calm but resolute. "I'm here to share my story and to show you how actions that might feel routine or harmless to you can have a profound impact on the people you interact with." Jordan shared details of his experience, describing the fear and humiliation he had felt. He talked about the importance of empathy and understanding, and how one's assumptions could inflict real harm. He could see a shift in some of the faces around him, a softening, as his words sank in. By the end of the session, several officers approached him, admitting that they had never considered how their actions could be perceived so negatively. One officer, visibly moved, admitted, "I never thought of it like that. It's just automatic sometimes. But you're right, we need to do better." It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Jordan had entered their world and, in doing so, had managed to reach them in ways he hadn't anticipated. As he left the precinct, he felt a surge of hope that maybe, just maybe, the movement he was building could bridge gaps that seemed insurmountable. As the months wore on, Jordan began to feel the weight of his work bearing down on him. He traveled constantly, spoke tirelessly, and met people who both inspired him and drained him. The constant attention, the never-ending stream of stories and pleas for help, the expectations to be a model of resilience, all of it started to take a toll. He found himself grappling with a weariness that felt as deep as it was consuming. One evening, he confided in Angela, the mentor who had become like family. They sat in her modest office, the city lights glowing through the window as she poured them both a cup of tea. "Angela," he began hesitantly, "I don't know if I can keep doing this. It's like, no matter how much I give, it's never enough. There's always more to fight for, more people to help." And I'm just one person. Angela nodded, her face softening with understanding. Jordan, you're experiencing something many activists face, a kind of emotional exhaustion. Compassion fatigue. It's hard work, carrying the weight of a cause. But remember, you're not responsible for fixing everything. You're planting seeds of change. And that's powerful. She paused, choosing her words carefully. Maybe it's time you reconnect with the reason you started this journey. Go back to the roots of why you began. That's where you'll find the strength to keep going. Taking her advice to heart, Jordan took a step back. He returned home, reconnecting with friends, family, and his own sense of identity outside of the movement. During this time, he rediscovered his passion, the original spark that had driven him to stand up in the first place. It wasn't about carrying the weight of the world, it was about making a difference, however small, in the lives he touched. Refreshed and rejuvenated, Jordan returned to his work with a renewed sense of purpose, finding a balance that allowed him to continue without losing himself. One of Jordan's most meaningful experiences came when he was invited to speak at a youth center in his old neighborhood. The center was filled with young faces, each one filled with a mixture of curiosity and admiration. These were kids who looked up to him, who saw in him a possibility for their own lives that they hadn't seen before. Jordan began his talk by sharing his story, not holding back the pain and anger he had felt, but also showing them the strength and resilience he had found within himself. He encouraged them to stand up for themselves, to believe in their worth, and to understand that they could create change even in the face of adversity. One boy, sitting in the back, raised his hand and asked, "How did you find the courage to keep going when everything felt hopeless?" Jordan paused, considering his answer carefully. "I realized that courage isn't about not being scared. It's about being scared and moving forward anyway. There were days I felt like giving up. But I thought of all the people who didn't have a voice, who didn't have the support I did. And I kept going for them. And for myself. You'll find that strength too, even on the hardest days." The boy nodded, his eyes shining with a newfound determination. As Jordan continued to speak, he could see the impact his words were having. He knew that these kids, with their own struggles and dreams, would carry his message forward. They were the future, and he had become a part of shaping it in ways he had never expected. Years passed, and the Justice and Equality Initiative became a powerful force for systemic change. Jordan's journey had taken him across the country and beyond, where he continued to speak, inspire, and advocate for justice. But he had also learned to balance his work with moments of peace, understanding that the strength to sustain a movement came not from constant action but from nurturing his own well-being. One evening, as he reflected on all he had accomplished, he sat on a park bench in his hometown, watching the sunset. His mind drifted back to the moments that had defined him, the fear and anger of that first encounter, the courtroom, the faces of the people he had inspired. He thought of his father, the unwavering source of wisdom and strength, and of Angela, who had guided him with patience and care. He realized how much of his journey was woven from the love and support of those who had believed in him. In that quiet moment, he felt an overwhelming sense of peace. He had become a symbol of resilience, not just because of what he had achieved, but because he had allowed himself to grow and transform. He knew now that legacy wasn't just about changing laws or starting movements, it was about planting seeds in the hearts of others. Seeds that would continue to grow long after he was gone. A young woman walked by, glancing at him with recognition. She approached him, holding a child by the hand. "Are you Jordan Blake?" she asked softly, a gentle smile on her face. Jordan nodded, smiling back. "Yes, I am." She looked at him, her voice filled with emotion. "Thank you. My son here. He looks up to you. He wants to be like you one day. And I want him to grow up in a world where he's safe. Where he's treated with respect. You've done so much to make that possible." Jordan looked at the young boy, who was watching him with wide eyes. He crouched down, meeting the boy's gaze. "You can be whoever you want to be," he said, his voice steady. "Remember, the world needs people like you. Kind, brave, and willing to stand up for what's right." As the woman and her son walked away, Jordan remained on the bench, feeling the full circle of his journey. He had begun as a teenager fighting for his dignity. And now, years later, he was passing on the lessons he had learned to the next generation. In that moment, Jordan understood that his work was a part of something timeless. It was a part of every person who had ever stood up against injustice, of every voice that had ever spoken out for the voiceless. And though his journey had been filled with pain, struggle, and sacrifice, it had also been filled with love, resilience, and hope. As he watched the sun dip below the horizon, Jordan felt a quiet, unshakable truth settle within him. His legacy would live on, not just in policies or programs, but in the countless lives he had touched and in the hope he had inspired. It was a legacy woven from courage, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between family, community, and a world that, little by little, was becoming a better place.